Let's talk about dogs. Our relationship with dogs started before we even discovered agriculture, around 20 to 40,000 years ago. Now, the most prominent theory about how dogs became dogs is the self-domestication theory, which pretty much just says that the more docile outcasts of wolf packs would wander into human camps searching for little scraps of food, and at first the humans were probably like, "Get out of here, you piece of shit!" But even our stubborn selves eventually found a reason to keep these guys around. They made for extremely efficient alarm systems. If a large, dangerous animal that was anything other than a giant hairless ape wandered close to camp, then the wolves/dogs would start growling and barking, and that is why humans decided to keep them around at first.
Side note!
Why did we start to domesticate wolves as opposed to any other animal? Well, for that, we have to go back to when humans first started wandering into Eurasia, thanks to our wonderful invention, fire. When we first wandered into Eurasia, we were invasive species. Wait, okay. Let's rewind a bit. Oh, stop there. The two main mammalian predators in most ecosystems are cats and dogs. And sometimes bears, but they don't eat nearly as much meat as the other two. Now, cats are ambush predators. They are stealthy. They are usually nighttime predators. They work well in forest environments where they can easily hide, and they are usually solitary animals. Now, the obvious exception to this are lions, but there are exceptions to everything in nature. Now, wolves, on the other hand, are persistence hunters, meaning that they chase their prey until exhaustion, sometimes biting little bits into their hamstring, leading to blood loss. And this is very similar to how we hunted before we had more advanced tools. Now, the big difference is that we could cool off while running with a little thing called sweat. That moist thing that allowed us to survive. We all love it. Now, while we could sweat, wolves had to pant, like dogs do. They have to stop every once in a while to catch their breath. Their solution to this is tag teaming. One member of the pack slows down while another one speeds up. Now, these persistence behaviors are the reason why dogs could eventually be used in things like herding livestock. The surrounding behavior that wolves do once their prey has stopped is also very similar to herding behaviors. Other behaviors that can be traced back to their wolf origins include things like how they chew bones with their back teeth. They gnaw it. Arr, arr, arr. But if they're ripping apart things, which for dogs is usually a thing like pillows or the entire couch, they use their front teeth. These are the teeth that wolves use to
Bite out chunks of their dying prey.
What was I talking about? Oh yeah. The fact that wolves are persistence hunters, but so were we. And as such, we started competing in the environments where our territories overlapped. But instead of one species outcompeting another, which is often the case in nature, we joined forces. Because like I said, there are always exceptions in nature. But one thing that was crucial for this was the fact that wolves have a social hierarchy, a social structure. This allowed them to understand where they were in the social hierarchy. They understood that they were quite low. This is also why things like horses were domesticated instead of zebras. Now, an obvious exception to this are cats, but they were never really domesticated the same way dogs were. They really only became friends with humans once we started using agriculture. Once we started growing crops, which attracted mice and rats, which then attracted cats that would eat them. And since they were useful to us, since they hunted down these pests, and they hunted them down very efficiently, we kept them around. Now, of course, since then they have been domesticated, but not nearly to the same level that dogs have been. This is why many cats will bring in things like dead mice and dead birds to apartments and houses, because they still have those instincts. They never really outgrew them. They are still fundamentally the same animal they were before being domesticated. Getting back to dogs, humans eventually started selecting certain puppies out of litters for tolerability of humans and less aggression, which further strengthened their bond with us. But it also had the fascinating side effect of changing their physical aspects very quickly. And this was the first real example of dogs being domesticated. Side note, a Soviet scientist by the name of Dmitry Belayev was asked to domesticate silver foxes as to make them more tolerable and less aggressive, to be able to get their fur off of them more easily. But what this Soviet comrade found was astonishing. You see, breeding certain members of the litter based on these behavioral patterns also had the side effect of changing their fur color. It added some weird colors, made them a bit spotted sometimes, but it also made their ears start to droop. The foxes started to bark a bit similar to dogs, and they started wagging their tails. In Eastern Ireland, there is an ancient monument called Newgrange. This monument is around 5,000 years old, and a group of scientists found a very old dog skeleton near this site. They started studying the fossils of this ancient dog, and what they found was fascinating. They concluded that two different groups of dogs were domesticated around the same time. One in East Asia and one in Central Eurasia, with the East Asians eventually becoming tired of all the and migrating here, doing some doggy style with the local dogs and plopping out a few puppies that were mixed. Now, many scientists don't completely agree with this theory due to one simple fact. It is based off a single specimen, which really isn't enough in many scientific endeavors to warrant this kind of theory. Some other theories include things like there was only one group in East Asia and some of them migrated west. Others think that these two groups of dogs diverged much later. Now, what we do know is that dogs originated from gray wolves, but that doesn't really help either, because at that time, gray wolves were an extremely dominant species and inhabited much of the northern hemisphere. DNA samples and evidence don't help either, because they concluded that the specific group of gray wolves that they originated from is most likely now extinct. But the theories are endless. Most ancient civilizations prized dogs, some more than others. A lot of times they were used for practical uses, obviously, but also for spiritual and religious purposes. Now, the practical uses included herding, guarding, hunting, tracking. Also, for example, the Romans used a certain breed of dog called the Canis Pugnax. Now, the Romans, the mighty warriors of Rome, thought that a dog would be useful in combat. That is how powerful this dog was. And keep this dog in mind because it will come back later. Also, the Romans used dogs for a pretty messed up reason that I will talk about later. And that right there is called foreshadowing. Now, I think the way that dogs are represented in these ancient cultures is fascinating. First off, you have Rome and Greece, which don't really have any major religious figures associated that closely with dogs, except maybe Hades in Greek culture, who had a three-headed dog as his right hand, not man, right-hand dog, I guess. Now, the Chinese culture was quite similar to this Roman Greek culture, and what these civilizations all had in common is that they would quite frequently bury dogs with owners, which is quite gruesome, but it shows that they put a lot of weight on their relationships with dogs. Now, the Chinese were also some of the first to actively domesticate certain breeds, with smaller breeds like the Pekingese and very large guard dogs like the Tibetan Mastiff, which still exist today. In fact, I believe that the most expensive dog ever was a Tibetan Mastiff. Egypt is very interesting because dogs represent a part of their culture that was extremely important to them. So much so that they decided to build a few giant pyramids because of it. I am talking about death. More specifically, the god of the dead, Anubis, not to be confused with the god of death, Osiris. Anubis was the god that took Egyptians into the afterlife. And he did this right after judging you with a scale. He placed a person's heart on one end of the scale and the feather of truth on the other side of the scale. If your heart was lighter than the feather, he would let you into the field of reeds, which is pretty much the ancient Egyptians' version of heaven. If not, then you could say bye-bye to heaven. I think it is very interesting that in this ancient religion and mythology, it is a dog that judges you in the afterlife, which just shows how pure dogs were thought to be even back then. However, the religion that placed the most significance on dogs was the Aztec mythology. In this religion, dogs are thought to be the ones to carry you into the afterlife, the ones to guide you into the afterlife. And it is thought that you can only go to a certain kind of heaven because they had multiple different types of heaven. You could only go to the best kind of heaven if you loved a dog somewhere along your life. Now, moving on to the Middle Ages, it was a bit different. Dogs were almost exclusively used for practical uses. This is a time when they bred dogs for many different uses, however. Mastiffs were used as guard dogs, spaniels and greyhounds for hunting, and many different dogs were used for herding, as well as bear and bull baiting for entertainment, and this is when bulldogs first appeared. The Renaissance was the time when keeping dogs just for company became popular again. The wealthy elite began to keep tiny little lap dogs and toy dogs as status symbols, and they started breeding dogs based off aesthetics instead of use. And greyhounds and other hunting dogs were also associated with these rich bastards. In the 18th and 19th century, the first modern breeds began to appear, and purebred dogs became a thing, and especially became popular and gained some traction in the land of deformed teeth, Britain. But now we get to a dark side of our history with dogs. Remember how I told you that the Romans used dogs for a pretty messed up reason? Well, that reason were the famous battles of the Colosseum. They pitted dogs against other animals, like they did in the medieval times with bear baiting and bull baiting, but they also pitted dogs against other dogs which is exactly what became popular in the 18th and 19th century, because by then, bear baiting and bull baiting had become illegal in most countries. The sport of dog fighting became a great source of entertainment all around the world. People used it to gamble all their money away, and hey, I'm all for gambling. It heals paralyzed people, and you can win up to 2,000% of your money while only being able to lose 100% of it. It's just worth it in every way. But when it involves dogs getting harmed, that is when I draw the line. In all seriousness, people would bet on certain dogs. Trainers would breed dogs to make them the strongest and toughest that they could be. Many bulldog breeds in Europe were being repurposed for dog fighting now that they couldn't be used for bull baiting. In America, they cultivated the pit bulls, and in Japan, they mixed some European breeds like mastiffs with some local breeds to create the Tosa Inu, a particularly large breed. Do you remember the Roman war dog, the Canis pugnax? Well, that was the ancestor of the Cane Corso, one of the scariest dogs alive today that was extremely useful in these fights. Say side note! Say side note! It's a side note! Say it! I know that right now, all the breeds I just mentioned sound quite scary and aggressive, but most of these trainers also train dogs to not be aggressive towards humans or be quite docile outside of combat. They did this so obviously they themselves wouldn't be at risk of getting attacked by their own dogs. So here is my proof that pit bulls aren't actually that aggressive. Unless they're named Cupcake. Now, dogfighting was banned in most countries by the 20th century, but some dogfighting events are still held to this day and are often associated with other illegal activities like drug dealing. Speaking of the 20th century, by then, most dogs were used simply for companionship and not for work due to the industrialization of much of the world. Of course, they were still used for things like herding and sometimes guard dogs. And a new breed, the German Shepherd, was becoming more and more popular. It was prized for its intelligence, trainability, and fantastic senses. But then, World War I hit. Soldiers were living under extreme conditions in the trenches, but one thing that boosted their morale were dogs. There were dogs just for this purpose, morale boosters. There were little terriers that would catch rats and mice that had moved into the trenches. There were messenger dogs that would go on dangerous missions to call for help or to send messages to the other side. There were even dogs that would search for wounded soldiers on battlefields that carried medical supplies on them, and they would also comfort soldiers in their last moments if they were beyond saving. In World War II, dogs were used for many of the same purposes, with a few new jobs considering the new equipment and tactics that Second World War brought. There were mine-detecting dogs, dogs that would search for survivors in bombed cities, and there were even dogs that would parachute into combat zones with their owners. Now, a famous dog from World War II was a Border Collie German Shepherd and Husky mix named Chips, who served in the US military and captured quite a few enemy soldiers. For his accomplishments, he was awarded many medals. While he probably didn't appreciate the medals, what he most certainly did appreciate is the fact that after the war, despite his many bruises and burns he got, he managed to live an entire, well-deserved year in peace with his original family before passing away in 1946. Nature is full of disputes between species, enemies, wars, survivors, warriors, hardships, predators and prey fighting for dominance, territory, or basic needs. However, these all feed this beautiful system and ultimately benefit everyone. However, there are also friendships, cooperation, and unspoken truces, and our relationship with dogs is one of these exceptions. Because there are always exceptions in nature.